So I forgot to start the video a little earlier. We went through and we filled in this, which is link in your Canvas page. So we are at the chemical equations. What is the chemical equation of one of them? And then we'll go with the other. So someone pick and tell me one of the chemical reactions. Your chemical reaction, you can kind of build off your picture, right? The arrows going in are the reactants, the arrows coming out are your products. So let's start with photosynthesis, I heard someone say. Photosynthesis. Oh yeah, I heard it before they even said it. Photosynthesis, okay? So what goes in, what are reactants? What are the arrows pointing inwards to photosynthesis? Because that's our chemical equation. We have CO2, H2O, and we have sunlight. So I'm going to modify that slightly, and I'm going to say we need 6 CO2s, because that's our balanced chemical reaction. We need 6 water molecules. We need some form of energy, which I'm just going to put parentheses, light. Arrow gives us what comes out of photosynthesis. C6H12O6, good, which is known as glucose, and what else comes out of photosynthesis? And how many of those?
6 O2s.
There's also 6 of those. So everything has a 6 in front of it except for the C6H12O6. There's already a 6. That's our balanced chemical reaction. Now, what's true about this equation and this equation? What's a similarity and what's a difference between those two equations? If I know the one, what can I do to rewrite the other one? Reverse it. But what is different? Besides the fact that products and reactants, that's definitely a difference. Well, what else? Type of energy. Very good. So if I simply take my reactants, my products, and I make them my reactants, I have 6 O2s, I have C6H12O6, arrow, 6 CO2s, 6 H2Os, and energy. But this time the form of energy is not sunlight, it's ATP energy. It's energy in the form of ATP, which is the energy that your cells use to do all the things that cells do. Should have done that a little while ago so it was easier to see. My apologies. I expect you to know, to be able to label all the parts of that diagram, and that's an expectation that I have for you, as well as, that's an expectation that I have for you on next Tuesday's assessment. You shouldn't be surprised to see a diagram very similar to this. You need one more. You should expect to see a diagram like this on next Tuesday's test. Next Tuesday, we have a test, and you should expect to see this diagram, not this one, but one similar to this, on next Tuesday's test. Okay? We did a graphic organizer the other day for photosynthesis. So here is a graphic organizer for cellular respiration. There's a word bank, just for the record. ATP in the word bank does not get used. Oopsie-doops. So there's a word bank. ATP I scribbled out because you are not going to use it, and I drew a blue line. And the blue line is meant to represent The word bank goes with the blue line down. So this is our chemical reaction, our chemical equation that I want you to try to do without looking at any other reference points. Try to do it from memory. What is the chemical formula for cellular respiration? But those words and numbers in the word bank get used in the circles and the boxes in the graphical organizer. There are some extra terms in there that I'm going to talk about today, glycolysis, pyruvate, electron transport chain, Krebs cycle. We're going to talk about it, but I don't expect you to know those. I'm not going to test you on that material, but it's something we're going to use as talking points. So take a couple minutes using the word bank, fill that into the best of your ability, and then we'll spend some time talking through it. This. It may not be perfect, but effort is important. Trying is important. Recursion would be a location. The prompt is glycolysis occurs in it's a location. right, let's talk cellular respiration. So cellular respiration begins with a molecule that we call glucose. So we call the molecule glucose. What is the chemical formula for glucose?
C6H12O6.
Good. Okay. Now, this says that cellular respiration begins with glucose, which is broken down during the processes called glycolysis. There are three parts of cellular respiration. There's glycolysis, there is the Krebs cycle, and there is the electron transport chain. Those are the three steps of cellular respiration, and I'm going to talk about those three steps today, but I'm not going to assess you on those three steps. But realize that cellular respiration is multiple steps that slowly releases energy, and there's actually three steps that this occurs in. Now, I've said cellular respiration occurs mostly in the what's the other location that cellular respiration occurs? And on your diagrams it was labeled the mitochondria. Most of it occurs in the mitochondria, but some of it occurs in the cytoplasm. And glycolysis is the part that does take place in the cytoplasm. So step one of cellular respiration occurs in the cytoplasm. Step one is called glycolysis. I'm not going to ask you to name glycolysis by name. Okay? What glycolysis does, and again, more detail than you're going to need to know for my purposes, but I just want to expose you to it and realize it's a much more complicated process than we are portraying, because depending upon if you take another biology class, you will see this probably again and go much more in detail. But glucose is broken down in glycolysis into we have a 6-carbon chain, and it's split into 2 separate 3-carbon chains called pyruvate. Pyruvate, sometimes referred to as pyruvic acid. So we take that 6 carbons, we break it into 2 3-carbon things. That happens in glycolysis, whether you have oxygen present or not present. Step one. Now, when we talk about cellular respiration, in our equation we say plus 6 O2 molecules, so we're really going this track, this pathway. But if there's not oxygen present, we go through glycolysis and then the next piece, but generally we're talking about this path. And what do we call it when oxygen is present? What kind of respiration is that?
Aerobic respiration.
That's aerobic. So this is aerobic respiration. And if aerobic respiration occurs because there is oxygen present, then the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain can occur, and both of those occur in the mitochondria. And approximately how many ATPs are produced during approximately, and that's kind of the approximate symbol. So approximately 36 ATPs are produced. So it's a range, it's an approximation. If I were to ask you a question that said how many ATPs are produced, and your choices are 36 or 18 or 1,000, you would choose the 36. If I gave you 1,032 or 16, you would choose.
32.
If I said 1,038, 12, you would choose.
38.
Okay, we're in the 30s. Okay, that's the point I'm trying to make. It's not an exact number, it varies slightly. Different publications have different ones, and I think it also varies within cells, types of cells and types of molecules too. But it's in the 30s number, okay? So 36, 38, 32, somewhere around that number is how many ATPs are going to be produced. So it's approximately 36, realize there's a range there. Okay, I kind of picked the middle number because sometimes you see 32, sometimes you see 38, so I kind of went middle of the road. So if oxygen is present, we go through this aerobic respiration. However, if oxygen is not present, then we call this anaerobic. Good. And we can do this for a little bit. We can't do it very long, but we can do it for a little while. And what do we call anaerobic respiration? It's also called fermentation. And there's two types of fermentation. Good. So there's two types. One is called lactic acid fermentation and one is called alcoholic fermentation. So depending upon which type of fermentation happens, depends upon which product is produced. Now these two boxes are interchangeable because there's no differentiating characteristics between the two boxes. Okay, so lactic acid and alcohol are produced. Which type of fermentation do we go through when we're sprinting? We go through lactic acid fermentation. Yep, we go through lactic acid fermentation and only lactic acid fermentation. There are other organisms that go through alcoholic and only alcoholic fermentation. The common thing that we talk about with alcoholic fermentation is yeast. And what yeast does, it's a living thing, it's a microorganism, but in the absence of oxygen, anaerobic, it'll go through alcoholic fermentation. So depending upon what type of process you're doing, depends upon what your desired outcome is. So if we were using yeast for fermentation, depends on what we're doing. If we're baking bread, the desired product of alcoholic fermentation is not the alcohol, it's the carbon dioxide bubbles that are produced to cause our bread to rise. Okay, there is a little bit of alcohol that's produced when you make bread. If we're fermenting, going through alcoholic fermentation to make alcohol, beer, wine, liquor, stuff like that, then the desired product is the alcohol piece of it. But a byproduct of it is the carbon dioxide. So depending upon what we're doing, depends upon which piece of that final product we want. But both are produced, carbon dioxide and alcohol. So one of the ways that we can determine or we can kind of quantify the rate of alcoholic fermentation is how much carbon dioxide is produced, how much bubbling is going on. So they sometimes talk about I think the term is proof your yeast. So you take some warm water, you take some yeast, you kind of stir it, it kind of gets frothy, and it starts to bubble. You're starting to get it ready for it to start to ferment when you make bread. Okay, so that's the idea. If it bubbles a lot, more fermentation is going on. If it doesn't bubble a lot, not a lot is going on. So you hear some stories sometimes if people make their own beer. You sometimes hear of pressure buildups in their fermenting vessels. I don't know the official terms for these things, but there's a little pressure vent. And the idea is during that fermentation process, producing alcohol, they're trying to make beer, so they want the alcohol piece. But carbon dioxide is produced, and if that thing gets plugged, it builds up and it builds up and it builds up, and eventually there's enough pressure buildup that that vent does kind of like unclog, but then it's not just a psst, it's like contents like spraying all over the place and making a big mess. I've also heard of people who brew their own beer that have bottled it and they put a cap on it and the fermentation continues within the glass bottles, which then the pressure builds up in the glass bottles, and the stories have always been like, I heard this like bad noise like going on in like some room, and they were like in their like a cabinet, and the bottles had so much pressure that the glass shattered and it sent glass shards like flying out. Luckily no one was in the room. So sometimes fermentation happens beyond, but carbon dioxide does create pressure, and we can get stuff like that. So in terms of, again, big kind of picture stuff, my expectation is you know what goes in and what goes out of cellular respiration. There are some steps. I'm not concerned that you know the 3 steps, but I was trying to put it kind of together, like cytoplasm is where glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, that's the mitochondria piece. Most of cellular respiration occurs in the mitochondria, but some of it does happen here. Okay? So, what goes in, what goes out, that's my chemical formula. So what do I need in order for cellular respiration to occur? Now we're talking the aerobic side of it. Chemical formula, what do we need in order for cellular respiration? What goes into it?
Oxygen.
We need oxygen. How many?
6.
We need 6 O2s. What else?
C6H12O6.
We need C6H12O6. We need glucose, or some type of sugar. We generalize, oversimplify, and say it's glucose. We'll talk about a few other sources of fuel in a little bit. And what comes out of these?
6 CO2. 6 CO2 and 6 H2O.
And if we are talking aerobic respiration, there would be about how many?
2.
If I don't remember if I said aerobic or anaerobic. With oxygen present, because we said plus 6O2,
Yeah, 36.
then it'd be aerobic, it'd be about 36 ATPs. Now, there's different types of sugars. This is this is glucose, but there's such thing called sucrose, galactose. Those are all called monosaccharides. Sucrose is actually a disaccharide. But there's monosaccharides. It's a simple sugar. We take two simple sugars, we call it a disaccharide. That's like table sugar, it's called sucrose. If we take a bunch of monosaccharides, we stick them together, we get something called a polysaccharide, like starch. Bread has a lot of starch, potatoes have a lot of starch. And that's another fuel source for us. So we talk about this process going on. If you eat a bunch of candy, oversimplifying, you eat a lot of monosaccharides, you eat a lot of glucose, that chemical reaction is going to occur very quickly. You're going to release that energy, and you're going to be kind of get that high energy burst, and you kind of get that crash afterwards because you used up that energy and now it's gone. The idea with like if you eat starches like breads and pastas, in order for you to go through cellular respiration, you first have to chop up those starches into smaller pieces, and then once those are broken down, then you can go through cellular respiration with them. The other fuel source that's even longer, so short term, simple sugars. Longer term is complex carbohydrates, starches and pastas, that kind of stuff. Even longer term energy source, fat. So lots of carbon hydrogen chains that we got to chop that up. And that's what this video, and this video is, for the record, is going to take us like right up until the class end at 10:50, but class does, or 11:50. But class goes officially till 11:50, so we're going to watch it right up to the end. And this is a couple scientists who are looking at some type of mice, and they look at the different